just going to jump in, although it's a hard act to follow. I think everyone has 2 kidneys. Does anyone have a spare to donate to the doctor? You know? Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm Bill Steele. I'm Director of Communication and Outreach for the Pacific Northwest Seismic Network at the University of Washington. And we partnered with the U.S. Geological Survey to cover the Cascade volcanoes and monitor earthquakes in the Pacific Northwest. Do I have control here? Yeah, okay, great. We're familiar with earthquakes here in the Northwest, but not as familiar as some areas like Japan or even California. We've had big damaging earthquakes in our region that have cost lives and many millions of dollars in losses, but we've been spared the worst kind of shaking, the big crustal fault that runs almost under our feet here, the Seattle fault. It will produce much stronger shaking than we've seen historically, and the Cascadia subduction zone will shake a heck of a lot longer than what we're used to. The reason for this is that switch it, always a backup. So the reason that this is happening this way is that 2 reasons. We're on a plate boundary with the Juan de Fuca plate, a little ocean slab offshore, converges with North America. And when you have a thin ocean slab of dense rock hitting a more buoyant continental rock, generally that ocean slab is forced underneath. And that's what's happening here. It's subducting or being forced under North America. So under our feet here, down about 70 kilometers, here about 80 kilometers down, we would run into this Juan de Fuca plate slab subducting beneath North America. And that's where those earthquakes occurred that we were looking at earlier in the newspaper. But California is also driving north, not just along I-5, but actually all of California is driving north. And it's coming at about 11 millimeters a year, and that runs into the Oregon coastal range, pushes that up to the north, and British Columbia is going nowhere. So we're being squeezed up against the buttress of British Columbia. And all of that strain that kind of is building up from California, driving north, it has to be absorbed here in the Puget Lowland. And so what we end up with is kind of an accordion where these red areas are uplifted terrains, the blues are deep sedimentary basins which amplify seismic ground motions. And in between those are big crustal faults. So we have the Seattle fault, the Tacoma fault, the South Whidbey Island fault, Darrington Devils Mountain fault, etc. So let's run that once more. Can we run that little, can you help me? There we go. So you can see that motion and all that shortening taken up here in the Puget Lowland. And that's kind of the big picture tectonics of where we get all of these earthquakes. But it's only recently, in fact, in 2001, I believe, 2000, that we first actually could lay hands on a crustal fault in the Puget Lowland. And the reason for this is that we've got glaciers coming down, and 15,000 years ago, we had almost a kilometer of glacier over our heads here. So that ice kind of wiped out all evidence of previous faulting, mantled the area with layers of sediment or glacial deposits, and covered over evidence. And what we found here in Bellevue, and this is a church parking lot, to the west of Vassar Park, we found million-year-old bedrock thrust up and over 15,000-year-old glacial deposits. So we were able to finally lay hands on the Seattle fault, and since then there's been numerous studies on numerous faults, and we have at least 10 active faults in the Puget Lowland that have been observed and trenched and studied. But the ground motion from this earthquake on the Seattle fault is going to be really devastating. This is a copy of an earthquake that occurred in AD 900, about 1,100 years ago, that lifted Bainbridge Island 7 meters and West Seattle about 7 meters in elevation. It caused large block landslides from Kirkland and from Mercer Island into Lake Washington and into Lake Sammamish as well, and generated tsunamis in those bodies of water and put a 7-meter wave in Elliott Bay. So this is a big deal. In addition, the shaking in downtown Bellevue and Seattle will be much greater than 1G in horizontal and vertical shaking. So that's going to challenge even well-built structures. So East Side's a little better off because your buildings are, in general, your building stock is more modern than in Seattle. We have more older structures that are more vulnerable to this kind of shaking. But the other thing that we've been discovering that kind of amplifies our concern is that we are both in the middle of the Seattle basin, which will amplify certain frequencies of ground motion. So how many here got calls from back east asking you to flee when the New Yorker article came out about the really big one a couple of years ago? I know I did. And unfortunately, our FEMA director at the time had an unfortunate quote. He was planning a Cascadia Rising earthquake exercise and said, "We're planning as if everything west of I-5 will be toast." Then Fox News picked that up that night, and they kind of amplified things a little. Everything west of I-5 will be gone. Seattle, Portland, Tacoma, 7 million people plus tourists. You know how news goes in these days. But in reality, the shaking in the Puget Lowland will be moderate. It's going to be perhaps a little stronger in some areas than the Nisqually earthquake, and of course, depending on where you are in relation to that earthquake. But that's the kind of shaking and damage, around 30% G in soft soil areas, maybe a little stronger, maybe 40. We're going to see damage for sure. We're going to see damage to infrastructure and utilities, and we're going to have a lot of islands created, at least temporarily, where one area is cut off from another, and that has to kind of function within there. And our just-in-time inventory practices will really complicate things, because we'll very rapidly run out of food and medicine and other things in grocery stores, for example. But it's not going to be doom and gloom, although I am lucky. I counted, I'm 6 blocks east of I-5, so my family is set. And you guys are probably pretty well off. But it is something we have to keep in mind. And the shaking from this, even though it's not as strong as the Seattle fault, will go on for minutes. So it'll be maybe 5 minutes of shaking, 2 minutes of it will be serious shaking. So that gives a lot of time for unreinforced masonry buildings and other poorly built structures to fail. And that's where our emergency services are going to have to be focused on. And we are moving now. The crust is deforming as we talk. When I came to UW in 1993, I went out that year with Dr. Brian Atwater and looking at these ghost forests near ocean shores that were drowned during the last Cascadia subduction zone earthquake in the year 1700. These red cedars were dropped into the intertidal zone as the earthquake release strain. A more recent picture, and I'm sorry I should have raised it a little bit, shows that that area is now drier and we get woody plants growing. So even over a period of a little over a decade, we've seen changes in the terrain out on the coast. We have a great history of earthquakes here in Pacific Northwest, from looking at submarine landslides in troughs off of the margin of North America, and we now have 10,000 years of big earthquakes, which gives us that roughly 500-year average reoccurrence for magnitude 9s. In between those, occasionally there are magnitude 8s in southern Cascadia, and you can see from that little arrow you are here that we could put another big line there and it would fit right into the picture. But it might be for a while. And this is the best case scenario for a Cascadia subduction zone earthquake for Seattle and Bellevue residents. This is looking at an earthquake that occurs midway under the Olympic Peninsula and ruptures up and to the north and to the south. So the energy is being pushed away from, most of the energy, from Seattle. So you've got some decent shaking. Certainly everyone will be aware and a little frightened by it when it's strongest. But it's really fairly moderate shaking over a long period of time, whereas Aberdeen gets hit a lot harder. But in a more likely scenario, a rupture that starts closer to California or in California and ruptures north, the basin here, our big sedimentary basins, trap that energy. And you can see the leading edge coming up. Crescent City gets clobbered, Portland gets good shaking, Aberdeen is right over it, and then look at Seattle. Now we could put this in Bellevue. We're going to have to get a run with a little seismometer here in Bellevue to show. But you can look at the strongest shaking really outside of that peak in Crescent City is occurring in the Seattle basin. And why is that important? Well, The Seattle Basin amplifies ground motions from like that 1 to 7 second period, and depending on what period you're looking at and what position you're in, it'll be more or less. But every tall building greater than 13 stories tall is either in Bellevue or Seattle in the middle of the Seattle Basin. And those are the buildings that will resonate at these longer period wavelengths. So our tall buildings are going to be subjected to much stronger ground motion than they were designed for in these scenarios. So the code's catching up, but we've had a whole lot of construction in the last 10 years, and that hasn't taken into account all of this ground motion. So one of the things, good news we have is that now we have an earthquake early warning system in operation. The way this works is that earthquakes generate P and S waves when a rupture break is happening along a fault. The P wave travels at almost twice the velocity of the S wave. The P wave is a sound wave, so it vibrates the ground, but it doesn't have a lot of damaging potential. But it carries a lot of information about the earthquake. The S wave that follows is the damaging earthquake wave, and it's traveling at a slower velocity. So if we can then analyze the earthquake with the arrival of the P wave in our seismic sensors, and we need 4 to see it, we can then, within a second to a second and a half, locate the earthquake, estimate its magnitude, and the intensity of ground shaking where you are and when that wave, the S wave, is going to arrive. Whoops, I'm sorry, I went the wrong way. And when that S wave will arrive at your facilities. And now, of course, we're sending, once we get that alert out, it's going at the speed of light. So it's moving faster than the P and the S wave, and so we can get seconds to minutes of warning that strong ground motion is on the way with this system. This year, we're doing because we've been testing this now for about a decade and making steady improvements, we're in a phase now where we're going to do limited public rollouts. We're actually making the opportunity for people to design actions that can be taken automatically when triggered by a ShakeAlert to, say, drop an elevator to the next floor and open the doors, perhaps open firehouse doors so they don't get jammed, alerting children in a school to duck, cover, and hold on to get in a safe place before the shaking arrives. There are water and sewer districts throughout this region that are putting valves on reservoirs and transfer switches on pump houses to cut power where fires might initiate and to preserve water so it's available for drinking and firefighting after the earthquake, even if there are breaks. So there's a lot going on with this pilot process, and I encourage you to think of what you might be able to do to improve the resilience of your organization with ShakeAlerts before the next earthquake arrives. And I'm going to be at UW ready to help you fill out a pilot application with the U.S. Geological Survey and be able to implement this year or the year following, depending on how we go. So right now, BART has been using this for almost 3 years now. It takes 24 seconds to stop a BART train traveling at 70 miles an hour. Those trains during rush hour have 10 cars and carry 1,000 passengers. Can you imagine what the result of one derailment would do to the emergency services and to the poor folks on that elevated train? Would be a huge disaster, right? In the midst of already a disaster with an earthquake. By slowing that train down using ShakeAlert, it improves dramatically its ability to stay on the tracks and reduces the chance of a derailment. So only a few seconds, they can slow those trains down, and they're doing that automatically now. And if you're on the train, you won't even notice it, because if you get too close to the train in front of you, it slows down anyway periodically as in part of the normal traffic flow. And then once it's determined how big that earthquake was or how strong it really shook, and when they have confidence they didn't take damage, they can ramp it right back up again. So these are the pilot projects that are coming online this year. We have everything from school districts. LA Unified is doing a school for the deaf, an elementary school and a high school, and doing different ways of communicating with students and finding ways of protecting them during an earthquake. There's a variety. NBC Universal is looking at slowing certain rides down in their amusement facility, opening garage doors on their fire stations and communicating with their operators and various employees around instantaneously when they get an alert. And there are hospitals and transportation systems. ODOT and WashDOT are part of this, and we're looking at ways of improving the resilience of our roadways and ferries, and maybe eventually stopping traffic from going onto dangerous bridges with alerts. So there's a lot going on, but we're just starting out, and we don't know what the best use is in your industry and your business, but I bet you could think of some things. So if you do and you'd like some help developing that into a real pilot project, I'm here to help. We found in Northridge and Loma Prieta that most of the injuries and losses were due to non-structural failures, people falling and things falling on people. We can prevent that from happening or reduce that dramatically with earthquake alerts. And it's cost effective. The federal government, it's going to cost about $25 million a year to operate the system along the entire West Coast. But we have $4.5 billion in annualized losses, according to FEMA, from earthquakes. So it's a very tiny percentage of the annualized losses to operate the system, and we think it will pay itself back many-fold. And that's it. I only have 10 minutes, and you have a very busy schedule. I really want to thank the Bellevue Chamber for squeezing me in on a very tight schedule. For more information, please contact me or visit pnsn.org, the website of the Pacific Northwest Seismic Network, and I'll be happy to hear from you in the future. Thank you.